To settle her father's debt, a poor young girl was forced into marriage with a stranger. But when she stepped into his lonely cabin, nothing went as expected, and neither did the years that followed. The girl didn't speak as the wagon rattled down the winding dirt path. Her hand stayed clasped in her lap, fingers cold despite the summer heat. Her name was Ruth, 17, thin from hunger, and with a pair of brown eyes that had seen too much sorrow already. Her dress was borrowed, her cousin's from 2 years back, and she hadn't even noticed the tear near the hem until they were halfway down the trail. Not that it mattered now. Nothing mattered but what waited at the end of this ride. Across from her sat her father, Thomas Barlow, shoulders slumped like he'd aged 10 years overnight. He didn't look her in the eye. Hadn't since that morning. His hands were stained from the tannery, still reeking of acid and animal hide, though he'd washed 3 times. He kept mumbling something under his breath, some prayer maybe, or maybe just a curse aimed at himself. The man driving the wagon was named Frank Dillard, heavy-jawed, with eyes like burnt coals and a voice that never softened, even around women. Ruth had only met him once 3 weeks ago when he came to their cabin asking about the debt. Her father owed him $147, money borrowed for livestock feed that never turned profit. The animals died. The loan didn't. Frank came back again and again, until one day he stopped asking for money and started asking for Ruth. "You got nothing else," Frank had said, "but your girl's strong, she'll make a good wife." Her father had tried to say no. He really had. But there was no sheriff who'd take their side, no pastor who could erase the ledger. And so that morning, Ruth had kissed her little brother goodbye, tied a ribbon around her worn braid, and stepped into a future with no voice in it. Frank's cabin sat at the far edge of Bitter Hollow, past the last row of pine trees perched against the foot of a dry mountain ridge. No neighbors, no mercy. As the wagon slowed, Ruth's stomach churned. There was no wedding, no preacher, just the exchange of a name and a door left open. "You live here now," Frank muttered, not bothering to offer a hand as she stepped down. Her father stayed seated, wouldn't even look up. She blinked back a tear as she stood on the dry earth. Then, without a word, the wagon turned and rolled away, carrying the man who raised her but couldn't save her. Inside the cabin was little more than a cot, a stove, and a table with one chair. No woman's touch, no sign of kindness. Frank didn't speak as he lit a lamp and pointed toward the cot. She stood still. "I said it's yours now," he growled. "I sleep out back, you'll clean, you'll cook, you'll earn your keep." That night Ruth lay curled in the thin blanket, staring at the rafters. The wood creaked in the wind and the silence pressed against her chest like a weight. Her hands trembled. She was alone. She was married, and no one knew what would happen next. But that wasn't the part that made her breath hitch. It was what she heard just before her eyes slipped closed. Frank Dillard, standing just outside the door, whispering to someone in the dark. "I done it like you said, now leave me be." The next morning she rose early and scrubbed the stove with cold water from the well. Frank wasn't in sight. A single plate sat on the table, half-washed, like someone had started the chore and walked off mid-thought. By noon she found him behind the barn, kneeling in the dirt, not praying, digging, his hands bare, fingers bleeding. "What ray you doing?" she asked softly, her voice hoarse from disuse. Frank didn't look up. "There's bones back here, lot of 'em." "Animal bones." He looked at her then, real slow. "I don't think so." She didn't ask anything else, just turned and walked back inside, her spine crawling with questions. Over the next few days, Frank hardly spoke. He left at dawn, returned by dusk, and never told her where he'd gone. He didn't ask about her, didn't raise a hand to her either. Just existed like a ghost that sometimes slammed doors and muttered when he thought she wasn't listening. But Ruth was always listening. She had to be. On the 6th night, thunder rolled in from the west. Rain pelted the roof, and the air turned thick with the smell of dust and pine. Ruth sat near the stove, trying to patch her only dress with thread she found in an old drawer. Frank burst through the door just after sundown, soaked, eyes wild. "She's back," he muttered. "She don't quit." "Who?" Ruth asked, heart racing. He didn't answer, just locked the door, checked the windows, then sat with his back to the wall like a man waiting for war. Later, when she dared to peek through the curtain, Ruth saw something in the yard, a shape, tall and still, halfway between woman and shadow. It stood motionless for hours, even as the rain fell. By morning it was gone. 2 weeks passed. Ruth kept to her chores. She swept, boiled water, baked what little she could with the flour and lard he brought back from town. She never smiled, never laughed, but sometimes she hummed, quietly when she thought he was too far to hear. One morning, Frank slammed a tin down on the table. "Don't hum," he said, "not in this house." She flinched. "Why?" He stared at her, his eyes red-rimmed, voice low. "Because it brings her." Before she could ask who, he stood and walked out. That night Ruth found a hidden drawer beneath the floorboard. Inside was a locket, small, silver, worn by time. Inside it a photo of a woman, not Ruth, not anyone she knew, and scrawled behind the picture just 2 words. "Forgive me." The wind howled louder than usual that night. The next week brought more than wind. A knock came at the door, sharp, urgent. Ruth froze. No one came out this far. No one ever knocked. When she opened the door, a girl stood there, 13 maybe, dirty-faced, thin, trembling. "I'm Clara," she said. "He married my sister too." Ruth's breath caught. "What?" "Frank Dillard. He made her come here. She was 15. She disappeared." Ruth's blood ran cold. "When?" "Last spring." The girl looked past Ruth into the cabin. "I think she's still here. I think she never left." Next up, part 2 of 8. Part 2 of 8. Continued from part 1. Ruth stood frozen in the doorway. The girl's voice trembled, but her eyes held no fear, only desperation. Clara clutched a wet bundle of cloth in her hands, her fingers raw and pink from the cold. "I followed the path my sister took," she said. "Mama's too sick now, but she always said we'd find her again. I waited a year." Ruth stepped aside. Her hand shook as she gestured toward the small wooden chair by the stove. "Come in. You shouldn't be out here alone." Clara hesitated. "Is he here?" Ruth shook her head. "No, he goes off early, comes back just before sundown." The girl stepped in, slow, careful, like a trapped animal, unsure whether it was walking into safety or a snare. The wind pushed the door closed behind her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Ruth handed her the last of the cornmeal bread from the tin on the shelf. Clara devoured it. She didn't chew much, just swallowed like she hadn't eaten in days. Afterward, she looked up and wiped her mouth with the sleeve of her dress. "My sister's name was Miriam," she whispered. "Frank said she'd be taken care of, promised she'd have her own home. He even gave Mama $5, but then she vanished. No letters, no visits, not even when Papa passed." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. She turned her eyes toward the window. "How long was she here?" Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she opened her bundle and pulled out a small piece of fabric, a torn scrap of a pink ribbon. "Mama tied this in her hair the morning she left. I found it buried under the porch." Ruth took the ribbon gently, her fingers brushing over the dirt stains along its edge. "He never spoke of her." "He wouldn't," Clara whispered. "He's a liar." Ruth wanted to deny it, to believe that Frank was just cruel and broken, but not dangerous. But then she remembered the bones he dug up behind the barn, the mutterings in the dark, the figure in the storm, and the whisper he thought she hadn't heard, "She don't quit." A terrible possibility settled over her chest like fog on the river. By late afternoon, Ruth had hidden Clara in the root cellar beneath the floorboards. She stuffed some old quilts and biscuits down with her, along with a chipped lantern and the last matches from the drawer. "If he finds you," Ruth's voice cracked, I don't know what he'll do." Clara nodded. "I'll stay quiet, I promise." Before Ruth could say more, the dog barked outside. She didn't even know they had a dog, must have wandered up from the woods, but it howled whenever Frank came near. She shoved the floorboard back in place and dusted it over, just as Frank pushed open the door. He was soaked again, like he'd been wandering through creeks, and his shirt was torn down one side. His left knuckle was bloodied like he'd punched a tree or a man. He stared at her with a look she didn't recognize, somewhere between panic and rage. "You see anyone today?" he asked, not even bothering with hello. Ruth shook her head. "No one." "You sure?" "I would have told you." Frank looked past her around the room. He sniffed the air like a hound, then stepped toward the stove and lifted the pot. Cold beans. He grunted and slammed the lid back down. "I saw footprints down near the gulch," he said. "Small ones, not yours." "Maybe a coyote," she offered. He turned. "You think I don't know a child's print when I see one?" Ruth didn't flinch. "If a child came by, I didn't see her." Frank stared a moment longer. Then he walked to the back room and slammed the door shut behind him. Ruth stood still until she heard the rickety bed creak. Then she dropped to her knees and whispered through the floorboard, "He suspects." A tiny whisper rose back, "I'll stay quiet." That night sleep didn't come easy. Ruth lay with one ear turned toward the crack in the floor, waiting for any sound. Outside, the wind died, but the silence brought no peace. It was the kind of quiet that let your thoughts shout. At some point in the deep hours, Ruth's eyes fluttered open to the sound of wood creaking. Not the floorboards, not the walls, something outside, something deliberate. She crept to the window and peeked through the torn curtain. There she was again, the shadow of a woman standing at the edge of the trees, pale dress, long hair, head tilted toward the house. Ruth's mouth went dry. She backed away slowly and crawled toward the floorboard. "Clara," she whispered, "are you awake?" No answer. "Clara." Then she heard it, a soft thud beneath the floor, like movement. "Don't come out," Ruth whispered. "Not yet." Another thud, and then silence. Ruth pressed her ear to the board. Nothing. And then, clear as day, a voice right behind her said, "She's not the only one under there." She whipped around. Frank stood at the doorway, his eyes bloodshot, a shovel in one hand. "I didn't want to tell you this," he said. "Didn't want to scare you, but since you're digging into things that don't concern you." His mouth twitched. "You ever wonder why the floor sags near the stove?" Ruth stood, heart hammering. "She's just a girl. She's looking for her sister." "I know what she's looking for. That's why I dug a little myself last year. Found more than bones." "What did you find?" Frank's face twitched. "A letter, signed by Miriam, said she'd leave, said she'd never love me." Ruth's hands balled into fists. "So you buried her?" "She ran," Frank snapped. "Out into the snow, never came back. I searched for days, but the mountain, it takes who it wants." He stepped forward. "But someone else put that letter there. Someone who wants me gone." Ruth backed up. "Who?" Frank's voice dropped. "Her." He pointed out the window. Ruth turned. The woman's shadow was gone. At dawn, Ruth snuck outside. She found the place where the woman had stood, right at the edge of the pine line. There in the dirt were no footprints, not a single mark, like she'd hovered there. Or like she wasn't real at all. She glanced toward the barn. The earth behind it was cracked, loose. The spot where Frank dug last month still hadn't settled. She waited until he rode into town. Then, with her hands and a garden spade, she dug. She dug for hours, until her nails bled, until her arms ached. At last her hand struck something hard. A wooden box, small, almost like a child's coffin. She opened it. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. "My name is Miriam Dillard. If you find this, I didn't run. I was pushed. He told me if I couldn't love him, I shouldn't live. Please, please find Clara." Ruth wept. And beneath the letter, wrapped in old muslin, were bones. She didn't sleep that night, not really. She kept hearing things, the floor whispering, the wind knocking on the door. Clara lay beside her now, out of the cellar, face pale as salt. "You found her," the girl whispered. Ruth nodded. "I knew you would." Ruth brushed hair from Clara's cheek. "We'll leave, as soon as he's asleep." But Frank didn't come home that night. Nor the next. By the third day, Ruth rode into town on the old mule, Clara behind her. The general storekeeper frowned. "Frank, ain't seen him since Monday." The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "What business you got with Dillard?" "I found something," Ruth whispered. "Behind the barn, something buried." The sheriff stared. "You come with me now." Back at the cabin, the sheriff and 2 deputies unearthed the box. They read the letter. They didn't say much, but they took Ruth's statement and Clara's too. By sundown, a search party had formed. They found Frank's horse near Widow's Pass. No sign of Frank. Just a single boot hanging off a rock edge. And a torn scrap of a pale ribbon. They didn't find Frank Dillard's body. Searchers combed the cliffs for 3 days, dogs sniffing the rocks, boots leaving fresh prints in old dust, but in the end all they found were questions, and that boot hanging limp from the ridge. Sheriff Burroughs stared at the empty canyon below and said what everyone else was already thinking. If he went over, the mountain's keeping him. Ruth stood back from the edge, arms around Clara, her dress flapping hard in the wind. She didn't cry, not when the sheriff told her, not when they lowered their hats, not even when Clara whispered, "He's gone, isn't he?" Because something inside Ruth refused to believe the mountain would take him without a reason. Not like that. Not so easy. They buried what remained of Miriam behind the chapel. A simple cross marked the grave, carved by hand with the name her sister had spoken night after night for over a year. Clara picked the flowers herself, white daisies, the kind Miriam used to press into the pages of her Bible. The whole town came, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of curiosity, or maybe just because it was the first time someone had been laid to rest for a sin everyone had silently watched but never dared name. That night Ruth and Clara stayed at Miss Penelope's boarding house. A warm bed, clean sheets, food that didn't taste of ash or sorrow, but Ruth couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the candle flicker, heart thudding like a hammer on pine. She'd been free for barely 2 days, and already she didn't know what that meant. She was Frank's wife anymore, if she ever truly had been. But she wasn't a daughter either. Her father had not written, had not come. Maybe he couldn't bear the shame, or maybe he'd sold his guilt to the same silence that sold her. "What are we now?" Clara asked from the bed. Ruth turned. "What do you mean?" Clara sat up. Without him, without her, without a place. Ruth crossed the room, sat beside her, and brushed back the girl's tangled hair. "We're not without, we're beginning." Clara blinked at that. "What if something follows us?" Ruth paused. "Like what?" "I think she's still here." "Your sister?" Clara shook her head. "No, the other woman, the one I saw outside the cabin." Ruth's blood cooled. "I saw her too," she whispered. "They left Bitter Hollow at dawn." No one stopped them. A few waved, a few whispered, but most just watched, eyes heavy with the kind of guilt that piles up in towns like that, quiet, weighty, passed from porch to porch like a sickness no one wants to name. They rode the old mule until it limped, then walked the last stretch of the valley until they reached a ridge where the wind carried the scent of pine and honeybush. That's where Ruth saw it, a small, forgotten cabin nestled in the rocks, empty, still, half buried by time. "This was my uncle's place," Clara said. "He died years back. No one wanted the land." Ruth stepped toward it. The door creaked, but the inside was dry. A fireplace, a loft, a place to start again. We'll make it ours. And they did. For the first time in months, maybe years, Ruth smiled. Real, full, like sunlight breaking past a storm. They cleaned, repaired the roof, found old linens in a chest that still smelled of lavender. Ruth trapped rabbits. Clara gathered berries. By the second week, they'd planted a small row of potatoes near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And yet every night Ruth still lit 2 candles, one for Miriam, one for the girl in the storm. She didn't know why. But part of her feared the mountain wasn't finished. By the end of the month, Ruth rode into town alone. She needed flour, salt, a new needle for the dress Clara had torn chasing a squirrel. The town had changed. Children didn't play in the streets anymore. Doors were bolted earlier. Even the saloon closed before sundown. Ruth asked the clerk at the store, "Something happened?" He nodded, face pale. "A girl went missing." "When?" "3 nights ago. Martha Kane's daughter disappeared right out her bed. No prints, no signs of struggle." Ruth felt her throat tighten. "And before that?" He hesitated. "Another girl 2 weeks back, from Clifftop. They found her dress snagged on a fence post near Widow's Pass." Ruth left the store without finishing her list. On the ride back, her mind spun. She reached the cabin just before dusk. Clara met her on the porch. "Someone was here," she said, "while you were gone." Ruth froze. "Who?" "I don't know. I found this." She held out a bundle of dried wildflowers, daisies. Not picked by a child, arranged neatly, laid on the windowsill like an offering. Ruth's breath hitched. Miriam's grave had those same flowers. Clara nodded. "And there's more." She led Ruth behind the cabin. There, scratched into the bark of a tree, were 3 letters. R.D. Frank's initials. The nightmares returned that night. Ruth dreamed of the cabin again. Not theirs, the first one, Frank's. She was inside, but everything was wrong. The floor dripped with water, the walls bled, and from the shadows a voice whispered, "You took what was mine." She woke screaming. Clara sat bolt upright, face pale. "I dreamed it too," she whispered. The next day, they went to the chapel. Pastor Green hadn't seen them since the funeral. He looked surprised when Ruth told him everything, the dreams, the flowers, the initials. He listened in silence, then reached beneath the pulpit and pulled out a worn Bible. "There are things," he said, "that dwell in guilt. Spirits feed on pain, and sometimes they don't move on until they're named." Ruth leaned forward. "Are you saying there's something still here?" "I'm saying that pain leaves fingerprints, and you, child, have touched too many." He opened the Bible to a blank page and handed her a pencil. "Write her name, the girl in your dream." "I don't know it." "Then guess, let your heart lead." Ruth's hand trembled. She thought of the figure, the woman in white, the whisper. Then she wrote, "Lenora." The candle beside the Bible flickered. Pastor Green nodded. "Bury that page beneath your hearth, and if she returns, ask her what she wants." That night they burned rosemary in the fireplace. The scent filled the cabin, sweet and sharp. Ruth laid the page beneath a stone near the hearth. Clara clutched a cross in her hand, whispering prayers. Midnight came. Then footsteps. Not from outside. From the loft. Ruth rose, heart hammering. The loft had been empty. She climbed the ladder, slow, candle in hand. The room was cold. At the far wall, scrawled in ash, "You married my killer." Ruth gasped. Then behind her, a voice whispered, "Lenora was my name." Next up, part 4 of 8. Part 4 of 8. Continued from part 3. The whisper curled through the air like smoke. Ruth's breath caught, the candle trembling in her grip. She turned slowly, expecting nothing, hoping perhaps that she'd imagined it. But the loft wasn't empty anymore. A woman stood there. Young, pale, dressed in white that shimmered like rain-soaked silk, her eyes gray, bottomless, locked with Ruth's. No blood, no wounds, just a stillness that didn't belong to the living. Ruth stepped back. The candle nearly slipped from her fingers. "Lenora." The ghost nodded once. You said I married your killer." Another nod. "Frank." The ghost blinked slow, mournful, then raised her hand, palm outward as if in warning. Behind her, the words on the wall bled darker. The ash deepened, and new letters crawled across the wood. "You are not safe." Then she was gone. Not vanished in a flicker, but dissolved like fog in sunlight. A blink and the loft stood empty once more, but Ruth felt it. The chill, the ache, the pressure in her chest that whispered, "There's more." She climbed down, her knees shaking. Clara waited by the fire, wide-eyed. "She was here, was she?" the girl whispered. Ruth nodded. "What did she say?" Ruth sat beside her, staring into the flames. "That I married her killer." "But Frank's gone." Ruth shook her head. "No, he's not." By morning, the ash on the wall had vanished, but the cold remained. The hearth no longer gave warmth. The trees around the cabin stood too still. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if the woods themselves had been warned. Ruth went to the nearest town, Benton's Hollow, under the excuse of buying seed. But her real reason sat folded in the inner pocket of her coat, the name Lenora. She combed through the county records, asked at the post office, even visited the church archives. No Lenora Dillard, no Lenora married to Frank, nothing. But in the back of a ledger, in faded ink, she found it. Lenora Beckett, born 1832, died 1849. Married to a traveling rancher, no children, death by fall recorded near Widow's Pass. Ruth stared at the words. They burned into her eyes. Same pass where Frank's boot had been found. Same story he told about Miriam. She ran, never came back. Too many stories ended the same way. She asked the clerk behind the desk, "Do you know where she was buried?" He frowned. "Unmarked grave. Mountain claimed too much of her. They never brought her down." So Ruth rode back to the cabin with more questions than answers, and a new name on her lips. That night Clara didn't speak. She watched the fire, her hands tucked beneath her knees. "She came again," she whispered. "When?" "Last night, after you fell asleep. She stood by the window." "Did she speak?" Clara shook her head, just stared like she was waiting. Ruth swallowed. "We need to find her." "She's already here." "No, I mean her grave." Clara looked up. "Why?" "Because she wasn't buried with a name, and now she's asking us to remember it." The next morning they packed bread, a canteen, and the small cross Ruth had carved from pine. Then they followed the trail toward Widow's Pass. The sun never fully broke through the clouds. The air carried the smell of earth long unsettled. Ruth kept her hand near her chest, where she'd pinned Lenora's name to her blouse with a brooch. They walked for hours. Around noon, Clara stopped. There, at the base of a jagged ridge, the earth dipped into a shallow hollow. Stones were scattered, not placed, just fallen, as if someone had tried to mark something long forgotten. Ruth knelt, ran her fingers over the soil. "This is her." She reached into her pack, pulled the cross and planted it in the center of the hollow. Then she pulled out the folded page from the pastor's Bible, the one with Lenora's name, and tucked it beneath a stone. Clara took Ruth's hand. They closed their eyes and prayed. When they opened them, the wind stirred for the first time all day. And far off, in the trees behind them, a figure turned and vanished into the woods. Ruth didn't chase it. She didn't need to. Lenora had been found. Back at the cabin, things began to shift. slowly, subtly. The birds returned. The fire warmed again. The air inside the cabin no longer pressed down like guilt. But Ruth still felt something watching. And 3 nights later, her fears proved right. It was just past midnight when the knock came. Not a gentle tap. A thundering pound. Ruth jolted awake. Clara sat bolt upright. "Don't answer it," the girl whispered. Ruth grabbed the rifle, unloaded, but the shape of it comforted her. She crept to the door. "Who's there?" No answer. Just another knock. And then a voice. Low, familiar. "Ruth, it's me." Her breath froze. She stepped back. The voice came again. "Ruth, you know me." Clara whimpered, "It's Frank." Ruth pressed a hand to her chest. "Go away." "You're my wife," he said, voice muffled. "You made vows." "You made graves," she spat back. Silence. Then laughter. Not cruel, not mad. Just broken. "I didn't fall," he said. "The mountain didn't take me, she did." Ruth stepped closer. "What do you mean?" She pulled me over. Her hands were cold. Her voice, she said I'd pay for all of them, but I did what I had to. They wouldn't stay. They didn't listen. "You killed them." He didn't deny it. "I gave them everything, but they were never satisfied." The door rattled. "I came back for you." Ruth raised the rifle. "You won't have me." "You already gave yourself." "No, that debt is broken, just like your lies." The wind howled. Then silence. When Ruth opened the door, nothing. Just footprints in the snow. And at the edge of the porch, a bundle wrapped in cloth. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was her wedding ribbon. And Miriam's locket. They burned it all. The ribbon, the locket, every trace of the past Frank tried to force on them. And still the dreams came. But they weren't nightmares anymore. They were memories. Lenora by a window, brushing her hair. Miriam humming a song by the fire. Even the girls Ruth never knew, the ones Frank stole before she came. Each face more vivid than the last. They were showing her. Preparing her. For something. Then came the day Clara fell sick. A sudden fever, burning hot, shivering cold, whispering things in her sleep. "She says he's coming," Clara moaned. "Says he's not done." Ruth wept beside her bed. "Who?" "She won't say." That night the fire roared higher than ever before. And from within its light, Lenora stepped out. Whole, glowing, tears in her eyes. "He's returned," she whispered. Ruth stood. "Where is he?" Lenora pointed toward the pass. "He's taken another, a girl, young, alone." "Who?" "She was trying to find her brother. He tricked her, like he tricked me." Ruth's fists clenched. "Where is she now?" Lenora's face broke. "You'll have to go where I died." "Then show me." And in the next breath, the fire went out. Next up, part 5 of 8. Part 5 of 8. Continued from part 4. At dawn, Ruth packed what little she needed: rope, water, flint, and a Bible worn soft with grief. She kissed Clara's forehead, still damp with fever, and whispered a prayer over her. Pastor Green had come before daybreak, roused by a message Ruth sent with a passing trader. He promised to watch over the girl. "She's caught in something spiritual," he'd said. "It's not just fever. Something S pulled her into the middle of this." Ruth nodded. "Then I need to go to where it began." The pastor gripped her hand. "Be careful. The devil wears the face you once trusted." She rode the mule into the hills, retracing the trail toward Widow's Pass, but this time not stopping at the ridge. Instead, she veered left, down a deer path that curved deeper into the shadowed parts of the mountain, places even trappers avoided. The air turned heavy, not from heat but from memory. Every tree, every turn felt watched, as if the past had grown roots and those roots now tugged at her boots. After 3 hours she found it. A clearing, dead still, no birds, no breeze. At its center stood the ruins of a cabin, one she'd never seen before but recognized in the bones of her dreams. The roof had caved in long ago. The chimney lay like a broken tooth. Ivy crept over the walls like fingers unwilling to let go. Lenora had died here. Or been buried. Or both. Ruth stepped into the ruins. The air turned colder. There, near what had once been a hearth, a pile of stones marked a crude grave. And on top of the stones, a doll. Old, rag-stuffed, its button eyes sewn crooked, mouth stitched in a smile that didn't reach its face. A chill rolled through her. Then came the voice. "You found me." Ruth turned. Frank Dillard stood at the edge of the tree line. No longer ragged, no longer wild. He wore the clothes he'd worn the day he married Ruth, a brown coat, dusty hat, and that leather belt she used to scrub clean with shaking hands. But his face, it wasn't right. Too pale, too smooth, like skin that had been stretched over something else. "You're not alive," Ruth said. He smiled, "Not like I was." "What are you?" He stepped forward, hungry. She raised the Bible. "You have no place here. You think that book'll stop me." "It isn't the book," she said. "It's the name in it." Frank flinched. "You don't speak of him." "I just did." The wind howled. The trees bent inward, and the sky darkened as if someone had dropped a veil across the sun. Frank's eyes glowed faint, red, pulsing like coals. "She was mine," he growled. "They all were, they promised, and promises bind." "No, you bought them, you broke them." "I fed them, I kept them warm." "You buried them." Frank screamed. Not like a man. Like something deeper, older. The ground shook. The stones of Lenora's grave tumbled. Ruth fell to her knees, clutching the Bible to her chest. "God of mercy," she cried, "you are not a stranger to the lost. Deliver the soul of the girl who cried beneath this roof. Deliver everyone he silenced, and bind him to the judgment he's long evaded." A flash. Not lightning, but light. Pure, blinding. It shot from the Bible in a wave, blowing outward like a wind through bone. Frank stumbled back, shrieking. His coat caught fire. His boots melted into the ground. And from the ruins, hands rose. Not bloody, not decayed, but glowing, gentle. Lenora stepped from the grave, her face serene. Behind her Miriam, then 2 others, 3, 4. A line of women, all walking forward, all staring at Frank. "You said we were yours," Lenora whispered. "We never were." Frank fell to his knees, clawing the dirt. "Please." But there was no one left to beg. The women closed in. And when they touched him, he vanished. Like breath on glass. Ruth woke near the edge of the clearing. The sun was back. Birdsong filled the air. The ruins remained, but the grave was empty. She stood, her bones aching, and turned toward home. But before she left the clearing, she found one thing left behind. A ribbon. Lenora S. Still tied in a bow. She picked it up, pressed it to her heart, and whispered, "You're free now." Back at the cabin, Clara's fever had broken. She sat upright, pale but smiling. "I dreamed of her," she said. "Lenora." Clara shook her head. "You." Ruth blinked at me. "You were standing in a field, holding hands with her, with Miriam and the others, and you were singing." Ruth sat beside her, tears falling freely. "They're gone now." "No," Clara whispered. "They're finally home." A week passed, then two, and life began to return. Ruth repaired the garden fence. Clara learned to trap rabbits. The forest grew green again, birds chirping in the mornings like nothing had ever gone wrong. But some nights, when the wind blew just right, Ruth swore she heard footsteps along the path. Not heavy, not threatening. Just familiar. Like someone checking in. Making sure she was still okay. She never feared it. She just whispered good night. And the breeze carried her words away. But peace, real peace, never lasts forever. And soon something else stirred. Not from the grave, but from town. Sheriff Burrows came one morning, hat in hand. "There's another girl missing," he said, "from down near the river. Family said she was asking questions about Miriam, about Lenora." Ruth's heart clenched. Who? She was kin to one of the others. He paused. "They say the man she was last seen with had Frank's eyes." Next up, part 6 of 8. Part 6 of 8. Continued from part 5. The name burned in Ruth's mind, even before the sheriff spoke it aloud. "He had Frank's eyes," Sheriff Burrows repeated, his voice like gravel. "Said he was a cousin passing through, name of Amos Dillard. He left town with her before sundown 2 nights ago. Folks say they went up the ridge trail, haven't been seen since." Ruth stared out past the cabin door at the mountains rising in the distance. The light hitting the peaks was thin and cold, like metal. Clara stood just behind her, fists clenched in the fabric of Ruth's skirt. "They're all connected," Ruth whispered, "every one of them." Burrows shifted his weight. "You already went up there once, brought back the story, brought back the ghosts. Now the town's looking at me and I'm looking at you. You know where to find him." Ruth tightened her jaw. "I don't, not yet." "But you will," the sheriff said. "And when you do, you'd better tell me before you go running off." He turned, started back toward his horse, then stopped and glanced over his shoulder. "You're not the same girl who left Bitter Hollow in a wagon. Don't forget to pray before you ride." Then he was gone. Inside the cabin, Clara sat at the table. Her hands shook as she sipped water from a tin cup. "It never ends," she whispered. "It's like they're born from the same shadow." Ruth crouched beside her. "It does end. It ends because we make it end." "How?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She walked to the hearth where the pine ribbon still lay on the mantel, a quiet promise to the dead. "Frank thought he could own souls," she said. "Now someone else does, but we're not going to run. Not again." Clara's eyes darted to her. "You're going after him." "I am. I'm coming too." "No," Ruth's voice cracked like a whip. "You're staying here." "I'm not a child." "You're 13. Clara rose. "And I buried my sister. I'm not letting you vanish like her." The silence stretched between them. The fire popped. Finally, Ruth sighed and pulled Clara close, her fingers threading through the girl's hair. "Then you'll do exactly as I say. No running, no talking, no wandering." Clara nodded. They left before dawn. Ruth took the mule. Clara rode pillion, her arms tight around Ruth's waist. They carried only what they could fit in a canvas sack: bread, a canteen, a small lantern, the Bible, and a coil of rope. The trail wound higher into the mountains. The air thinned. Pine gave way to scrub, and the path grew stonier, narrower, until only a single mule's width remained between the cliff wall and the drop. By midday they reached a fork. The main trail bent toward Widow's Pass. The other, almost hidden, slid down into a shadowed gulch choked with bramble. Clara pointed. "Tracks." Ruth dismounted, crouched low. Prints in the dust, one set small, one set larger, fresh, heading into the gulch. She tied the mule to a tree. "We go on foot." The gulch closed in quickly. The light dimmed. The smell changed, less of earth, more of water long trapped. They walked for what felt like hours until the walls opened suddenly into a basin hemmed by stone. And there it was. A cabin. Not ruins, not collapsed. Standing. Waiting. It was almost identical to Frank's. The same slanting roof, the same narrow windows, but the wood was darker, as though it had been burned and rebuilt from its own ashes. Smoke curled from the chimney. Ruth's heart thundered. She motioned for Clara to stay back. Then she crept forward. Through the window she saw a man sitting at the table, broad shoulders, hat tipped low. A girl barely 15 sat across from him, eyes blank, hands folded in her lap like she'd been told to sit still. Ruth pushed the door open. The man looked up. His face was familiar and wrong at the same time. Frank's jawline, Frank's eyes, but younger, smoother, like the mountain had carved a new mask over an old skull. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice low and even. "This isn't your business." "It became my business the moment you took her," Ruth replied. He tilted his head. "I didn't take her, she came." Ruth glanced at the girl. "Is that true?" The girl's lips trembled. "He said he'd show me where Miriam was buried." Ruth stepped closer. "You're lying to her." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm giving her what she asked for." "No, you're taking what you think you're owed." He rose slowly. "Frank always said you had fire. He said you were the one who'd last, that you'd understand." "I understand enough." "You understand nothing," he hissed. "He wasn't the first. He won't be the last. We're bound to the bargain, the blood, the debt." Ruth cut him off. "No, the debt's paid." She pulled the Bible from her coat, opened it to the blank page where she'd written Lenora's name, now darkened to near black with oil and ash. "You know this name." The man's smile faltered. "That's not for you too." "She's free," Ruth said, "and so are all the others. Whatever holds you is breaking." The man's face twisted. "You think you can break this? You think you can stop what started before you were born?" "I don't have to stop it," Ruth said. "I just have to bring it into the light." The girl at the table suddenly gasped. Her eyes rolled back. She began to tremble, voice cracking into a high wail. "She's here," the girl cried. "She's in the room." The man's head whipped around. "No." The lantern on the wall shattered. And in its flickering glow, Lenora appeared. Not pale this time, not ghost-like, whole, bright. Her hair streamed behind her like a river of light. She walked straight to the girl and touched her forehead. "Hush, child," she whispered. "You're not alone." Then she turned to the man. "You made the same bargain," Lenora said. "But you're weaker. You borrowed his face, his hunger, but you'll never have his hold." The man stumbled back. "You can't touch me." Lenora stepped closer. "I already have." His skin cracked like porcelain. Ruth grabbed the girl from the chair, pulling her toward the door. "Go," she hissed at Clara. "Take her, run." Clara hesitated. "What about you?" "Run." Clara dragged the girl out into the gulch. Ruth turned back. The man was changing, his form splitting, warping, flickering between Frank and something older, darker, its eyes like holes punched into night. "I'll take you instead," it hissed. "No," Ruth said. "You'll face what you've done." She held up the Bible. "God of justice, you freed Lenora. Free this child of his hunger. Free the earth of his shadow. Send him where you've kept judgment waiting." The creature lunged. Light exploded. Ruth woke sprawled on the cabin floor. The roof was gone. The walls were gone. Only the hearth remained, stones blackened but cold. Lenora stood over her. "It's done," she whispered. Ruth struggled to sit. "Where is he?" "Bound," Lenora said. "Not to you, not to them, to where he can do no more harm." "And the girl?" "Safe." Ruth pushed herself to her feet. "Clara." "She's waiting for you." Lenora's face softened. You've carried a weight not yours. You've broken a chain older than you. But the mountain still holds secrets. When you hear it calling, don't answer." Then she was gone. Ruth staggered outside. Clara sat in the grass with the girl, holding her like a sister. Both were pale but breathing. "Is it over?" Clara asked. Ruth knelt, gathering them close. "For now." The girl looked up. "I saw them, all the women, they were free." Ruth nodded. "They are." A breeze rolled through the gulch, lifting dust and pine needles. For the first time in months, Ruth didn't feel a shadow in it. She felt release. But deep down, she knew something was still coming. Not from Frank, not from Amos. From the mountain itself. That night back at their cabin, Clara asked, what did she mean when she said don't answer? Ruth stared into the fire. "I don't know, but I think we'll find out." She touched the ribbon on the mantle. And in the crackle of the flames, she swore she heard a voice, gentle, faint, almost a song. Not a warning. A promise. Next up, part 7 of 8. Part 7 of 8. Continued from part 6. Ruth tried to live like it was over. She planted onions in the thawed rows near the creek, taught Clara how to weave rope from the dogwood stalks, patched old wool into a blanket for the girl they'd rescued. Her name was Elsie, they learned. Quiet but bright, she moved through the cabin like a child trying not to take up space, always listening, always watching. Ruth gave her the bed and took to sleeping near the fire again, where the hearth crackled like an old friend and sometimes whispered more than it should. A month passed, then another, and just when the earth began to warm and the snow retreated into higher ridges, Clara asked the question Ruth had been waiting for. Is it really done? Ruth didn't answer right away. She looked out the cabin window toward the tree line. Birds chirped, rabbits darted, and yet. No, she said quietly. It's quieter but not done. Clara swallowed. I dreamed of the pass again. The same one. Clara shook her head. Different, but it was dark, and there were voices. I couldn't understand them, but they were pulling something up. Ruth stood from the table. How many times have you dreamed it? 3 nights now. Ruth turned toward the mantel where the ribbon still lay, but next to it, new, was a dried pine cone coated in black tar. She hadn't placed it there. Later that afternoon, she went into town. The general store clerk waved. The pastor stopped her in the square. A new family had moved into the area, a widow with 2 sons. Another girl had gone missing near Cold Hollow a few weeks ago, though no one was talking about it. Ruth asked the sheriff if any Dillard kin still lived nearby. He rubbed his chin. There's a cousin, Elric Dillard, farther north out toward Hanging Rock, reclusive, claims he's a preacher, started his own gathering, but folks say it's more chanting than sermons. Anyone ever disappear near him? The sheriff's eyes narrowed. You looking to start something? I think something already started. He nodded slowly. Then be careful where you dig. That night, Ruth prayed harder than she had in weeks. She knelt by the fire, Bible open, hands folded around the locket she'd kept from Miriam's grave, the only thing that hadn't burned. I don't ask for signs, she whispered, just direction. If it's not done, if there's something else waiting, I need to know what to do. I can't lose Clara or Elsie, not again. The fire popped. Then slowly the air in the cabin thickened, not with smoke, with presence. Lenora appeared beside the hearth, her face somber, her form dimmer than before. You were warned, she said. About the mountain, Ruth asked. Lenora nodded. It never wanted us. It only wanted what we carried. What does it want now? You, Lenora whispered, and the girl who sings when she thinks no one hears. Ruth turned toward the loft where Clara slept. No, she said. Lenora's expression didn't change. A wound this deep bleeds through generations. What do I do? Lenora knelt beside her. You go to where it began, where the blood first touched the soil, before Frank, before Amos, before me. Where? Hanging Rock. The next morning, Ruth packed quietly. She meant to go alone, but Clara woke before dawn, dressed and waiting at the door. "You can't stop me," she said. Ruth didn't argue. She only turned and nodded. Elsie stayed behind, watched over by Pastor Green. They left on foot, following the creek north until the trees grew stunted and the sky took on a strange gray tinge, even under sunlight. The road narrowed to a path, and the path to a trailless incline, until finally they saw it, a ridge of jagged red stone jutting from the hillside like a spine. Hanging Rock. A single cabin stood beneath it, newly built, sharp-angled, with a steeple and a cross carved in bark upside down. Smoke rose from its chimney. As they approached, they heard voices. Low chanting, not English, not prayer. Ruth stepped first, pushed the door open. Inside, 10 people stood in a circle, hands joined, heads bowed. At the center stood Elric Dillard. Tall, thin, eyes glassy like a snake that had forgotten how to blink. "We've been waiting," he said, not surprised. "You're not a preacher," Ruth said. "I carry the word," he replied. "You carry rot." He smiled. "Then you know what's buried beneath this rock." Ruth tightened her grip on the Bible. "Tell me." "Frank was just a vessel," Elric said. "A cup poured from an older spring. This land, this mountain, it remembers the cries of the first woman burned here. She was a healer, a guide. They called her witch. So they hanged her from that stone, and when she died, the wind changed. And she cursed the land." "She consecrated it," Elric whispered. "With her pain, her blood fed the shadow, and it grew hungry. It needed vessels, Dillard men." "Then it ends now," Ruth said. Elric raised his hands. "You can't kill what's fed on generations." "I don't have to kill it," she said. "Just starve it." She opened the Bible, spoke the name Lenora had given her. Salome. The air snapped. The chanting stopped. The followers cried out, clutching their heads. Elric fell to his knees. The rock cracked. From the ground a mist rose, black, coiling, screaming. And then Ruth stepped forward, holding the Bible high. "By the name of the Son, by the mercy of the Father, and by the Spirit who hovered over the waters, I cast you out." The mist shrieked. Clara grabbed Ruth's hand. Together they shouted, "You have no place here." The mist exploded in a gust of wind, so strong it knocked the cabin walls flat. The people inside fled into the forest. Elric lay on the ground, twitching. From beneath the shattered steeple, a woman's whisper rose. "Thank you." They buried the remains, bones old and worn, found beneath the rock. They carved a cross, not upside down, not backwards. They prayed over the earth. And as they turned to leave, a breeze rustled the grass. Not cold, not heavy, just clean. That night back in their own cabin, Clara asked, "What happens now?" Ruth wrapped her arm around her. "We live. And if something else comes, we'll be ready." Clara laid her head on Ruth's shoulder. "What if this is why you were born?" she asked. "To end it." Ruth smiled. "No, I was born to begin something else." Next up, Part 8 of 8 final. Part 8 of 8. Conclusion. Spring melted into summer, and the mountains began to hum again, not with whispers or hauntings, but with wind, bees, and the soft laughter of 3 girls working soil and threading new life into old land. The cabin, once a place of sorrow and shadows, now bore a roof stitched with care, window panes that caught morning light like stained glass, and a garden teeming with promise. Elsie had begun to sing again. She hadn't spoken much the first weeks, her words locked behind old fear. But now, with Clara beside her and Ruth showing her how to bake, stitch, and ride, she sang, quietly at first like she was unsure she had the right, but each day her voice grew steadier. Clara, once haunted by silence, harmonized without thinking. Two girls who had been hunted by legacy now carried joy in their lungs. Ruth watched them with something deeper than pride. It was peace, earned, fought for, and still fragile as a new leaf on the edge of a frost. But it was real. The kind that filled your chest when you watched the sun rise and realized you didn't have to run anymore. But peace was not the end. One morning, as she split wood near the edge of the clearing, a rider came up the trail. It was Sheriff Burroughs. He looked older than he had weeks ago, his mustache grayer, shoulders tighter. "Ruth," he said as he dismounted, "got a letter for you." She wiped her hands and took the envelope. The writing was unfamiliar, neat, small, deliberate. "What is it?" "Came from downriver, from a man named Ezra Green. Said he was the son of a woman named Salome." Ruth's heart dropped into her boots. She tore the letter open. To the one who carried the flame. "My mother was never what the town made her. She helped people, healed children, and saw things others were too afraid to name. They feared her, so they ended her. But her voice came to me every night in my dreams, telling me someone brave would one day unearth her name. That was you. I want you to know, her story won't die again. My family's debt is not the only one. There are others, other names, other places where pain has been buried too long. You gave my mother a grave, now I'll give others the same. Thank you for giving her rest, for giving her back to me. Ezra Green." Ruth folded the letter slowly. Burroughs watched her. "You okay?" She nodded. "I think someone's watching now, just not in a bad way." "You always did carry more than most," he said. "What are you gonna do next?" Ruth looked toward the garden, where Clara and Elsie laughed over a runaway chicken. "I'm going to teach them to carry less," she said. That afternoon, Ruth sat on the porch, sewing patches into Clara's dress while the girls played by the creek. A breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed pine and something sweeter, lavender maybe, or wild mint. She paused. That smell had once reminded her of Lenora. It still did. But now it didn't carry weight. It carried memory. Ruth leaned back and let her thoughts drift. She remembered Frank's voice, broken, cruel, twisted by a darkness he never tried to fight. She remembered Miriam's locket, Clara's trembling hands, the figure in the storm. She remembered the cabin that swallowed voices, the grave that whispered of the past, and the fire that burned but never consumed. She remembered a young girl, forced into marriage, betrayed by blood, and dropped at the edge of a wilderness no child should have faced alone. She remembered surviving. And choosing. Later that evening, as they ate together by lamplight, Ruth looked at the two girls she now called her own. Elsie, curious and soft-spoken, with a quiet strength Ruth had seen only once before, in Lenora's eyes. Clara, sharp as flint, stubborn as mountain stone, with hands already calloused from work and a heart that refused to give in. They were not hers by blood, but they were hers by bond. By fire. By choice. That night Clara came down from the loft, barefoot, holding the ribbon from the mantle. "Can I keep it?" Ruth smiled. "You don't need permission." Clara nodded and sat beside her. "Do you think she still watches?" "Lenora." "All of them." Ruth thought for a long moment, then nodded. "I think they watch until they know we're not afraid." "I'm not afraid anymore." Then they're smiling. Weeks later, a woman arrived in town, a traveler with a baby on her back and a bruised arm. Said she'd run from a man who drank too hard and hit too often. Said she'd heard about a woman who could help. They sent her up the mountain. To Ruth, who opened the door wide and said, "Come in, you're safe now." In the years that followed, more came, one by one. A girl who'd fled a gambler father, a widow turned out by her husband's kin, a boy who couldn't walk but knew how to carve birds from pine. Ruth took them in, not as a savior, but as someone who knew what it meant to have no one. They built another cabin, then a third. They called the place New Hollow, a place not of forgetting, but of healing. The shadows never came back, but the wind still sang sometimes. And when it did, Ruth would lift her head and smile, because she knew exactly who was singing.